So recently The Division has been widely praised after the beta, but has been almost equally criticised that it was disappointing and was not what had been promised. Now I lay the blame for this squarely at the doors of hype. Hype is generated by developers, publishers, gaming media, which includes traditional media like Polygon, IGN, Kotaku, as well as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc, etc. Also, the gaming community itself, players hyping up other players, sharing articles, filling forums, and generally foaming at the mouth over the promise of shiny things and what ifs. What I'm going to try and show you today is that major publishers are shifting significantly more copies of a game pre than post-release. That's why everything, even DLC, are now packaged for pre-release sale. The problem with this is that it's nearly impossible to find data related to this because companies keep sales and pre-order sales locked down harder than state secrets. In fact, the only example I could find to illustrate what I think most people logically would conclude anyway was only released because of a lawsuit. Now, thankfully for us, it was, because it can be used as a benchmark to reasonably estimate other games based on their status and sometimes information from the company. What we're going to talk about today is the connection between hype and pre-sales of a game versus the post-release sales and then player disappointment and abandonment. Another major problem is that on PC or even just digital sales are not really given out unless you use something like Steam Spy, but again, that doesn't show all the data you need, and indeed many big publishers use their own platforms such as Origin, Uplay, etc. Websites like VG Charts tend to show physical copies sold as well as being somewhat kind of estimations of those sales, which in the digital age just doesn't show us the whole picture. So the numbers that you have to work with are very much estimations, and therefore the conclusions you can draw in and of themselves have to be very speculative. Now, before I get into my own conclusions about this stuff, let's just talk about those sales figures. So, and again, remembering that they are fairly estimations, we don't have the whole picture, so you have to, make a bit of a leap of understanding there, and also, at the same time, you have to kind of take everything with a pinch of salt. But even so, I think that with the numbers you do have available, you can make a fairly reasonable estimation there. So, back in July of 2015, EA announced that pre-orders have been extremely strong for Star Wars Battlefront. They went on to state that they expected the install base for PS4 and Xbox One to hit 49 million by the end of the 2016 fiscal year worldwide. Now, that is their estimation for pre- and post-sales. But that doesn't help us at all. That only tells us how many copies they're expected to sell in total, not what percentage of those sales were pre or post. Now, VG Charts has some data on this, but it only has the post sales. It states that global sales up to January 2016 were cross-platform about 10 million combined. It's important to note that these should not be considered, as I said before, highly accurate, but more estimations. More telling is the week-by-week sales drop-off, where in the first weeks the game is shifting several million a week, but by January that's dropped down to as little as 100,000 copies a week. Now that's important because it means that if most of the sales are happening in the first 4 weeks of the game's release, it means that all of the rest of that time is, up until March when they were expecting to hit that kind of estimation. It means that if they're not really selling any content, then the rest of those copies must be pre-orders. So, could Battlefront have shifted nearly 40 million copies just as pre-orders? It seems like a crazy amount. To meet that near 50 million target in 2016, it seems like a huge amount. Far too much to expect as a pre-order. Well, that was my first thought, until you look at the data that came out of a lawsuit called the Marty O'Donnell lawsuit. This was against Bungie and Destiny. He was a disgruntled worker from them. Now, this information that came out of that lawsuit, which is publicly available, revealed that Destiny sold $500 million worth of pre-orders or pre-purchases, however you want to term it, and post-release sold 6.3 million units in the first month. That brought them in $47.5 million worth of sales. Now, you can quickly see that based on the post-release figures, we could estimate that somewhere in the region of 60 million units of pre-order purchases came based off of that information. Now, because most game releases have their sales figures locked down so tight, all we can do is guesstimate using the figures which had to be released in a court case. Now, as a guideline, we could certainly speculate that this is how Star Wars Battlefront would reach its 50 million unit target for March 2016. Seeing as using the VG charts as a reference, we can see sales have pretty much flatlined by the first week of January 2016. And this is common among most titles. If you look through the data on VG charts or other information sites you might find online, most games have a huge spike and then trail off after a month or so. I think for most people, that's a fairly obvious sales pattern to occur, right? This means that we could then make a fairly reasonable guess that Star Wars Battlefront sold as many as 40 million copies in pre-orders. And this is where we start to get into the real question of the matter. If a game is selling 80% of its copies pre-release, that means publishers are securing the vast majority of sales before the game is even played by the public. Now, as a consumer, that is a huge problem, because it means that people are putting down money on games ahead of release on a vast scale, when there is often really very little reason to do so. It also means that even if the game were to crash and burn in the first week, there will be no liability to the publisher, meaning there is no incentive that things would get changed or to ensure that the product is of a high quality to meet consumer expectation next time around. Simply put, there is no risk. And then it means that they will just do the same thing over and over and over. And that is what I think most people have begun to realise is happening now. You might think, well, if I get burned by a game, surely I would just wait for the next game to come out and then not pre-order. Or beyond that, maybe I won't even purchase their next game. That doesn't seem to be the case though when you look at the figures available, which I'll just reiterate are very hard to come by. Now, I've often jokingly said that when in comments or social media or just anywhere online, you see people saying, oh, I won't be pre-ordering next time. I always say, yeah, that guy's going to 100% pre-order. Well, judging by the trend of AAA game releases, that seems to be the case. In part, I think it's that wishing or believing on part of the consumer that things are just going to be different next time around is what keeps bringing people back again. There are other odd examples when you have to wonder just what is going on. The recent Rise of the Tomb Raider, which gathered around 330,000 sales in the first week, but it didn't meet its sales expectations. Brian Horton, who's the game director at Crystal Dynamics, noted, despite this, both Microsoft and Square Enix were, quote, very happy, but with no mention made of how these figures compared to pre-order sales. And again, you could make a logical jump there, that if they were very happy, but sales didn't meet their expectations in that first week, well, why are they very happy? Could it be because they had plenty of pre-orders, so on the whole, they still made up the numbers they were thinking of? It seems like a pretty reasonable jump to make. What's concerning is that some publishers are happy to show post-release data, while others do not. And when they won't give out sales data, it's often related to titles that among the gaming community are considered to have tanked hard. Yet for some reason, the games themselves don't seem to be considered commercial failures. Look at titles like Titanfall and Evolve. They both crashed hard after release, especially on PC, and finding post-release data seems to be almost non-existent. Yet the companies producing them both made statements saying they were happy with sales overall. Titanfall quoted as having at least over 900,000 on pre-order alone. Both of these had massive hype in the run-up to release. Evolve, when I saw it showcased at EGX in London, had such a massive queue that if you wanted to check it out, you had to spend at least 2 to 3 hours queuing for it. Such was the sort of overhype excitement for the game. And yet I actually asked a few people queuing, why they were so excited for the game, and nobody seemed to really know. They just knew that it was something new and really exciting and it was going to be awesome. But, they couldn't say anything more than that. And that kind of goes towards the point about hype. It's often driving this kind of irrational excitement about things. Publishers don't seem to want sales data out there because it would seem clear that consumers could very easily then make this correlation between pre-order and hype versus release sales and player count. It's essentially a way of minimizing risk, but also it's kind of exploiting consumers because you're being hyped into buying a product which you very often only have marketing to base that decision on. Now, I can hear it already, okay? People are just saying, no, you're not being exploited because you're making a choice about how to spend your money. Sure, of course, okay? But then, if that were the case, why do people continually spend out time and time again on titles which are questionable as to their longevity or the accuracy of the content compared to the hype campaigns? If people hate pre-orders so much as we routinely hear about, then why are people still making them? The answer, I think, is actually pretty simple. It's the carrot and the stick. People coming to the simple conclusion of, well, I'm probably going to just buy it anyway, I might as well buy it with the extra jacket or weapon skin included or some special tag. And I think it's also partly to do with this kind of mentality that, say you have 5 friends and 3 of those friends are pre-ordering and they're going to get the extra stuff. Do you want to be the odd ones out who don't get that stuff? Are you going to be able to make that stand? I think for a lot of people there is actually a bit of peer pressure there in terms of wanting to purchase it. Now, I've got nothing to back that up, that's only my own sort of thoughts about it, but I think that again is a fairly reasonable conclusion. And I did speak to a few people today who kind of said, like, yeah, if somebody else was getting it and we were playing together, I'd be more likely to set in on that. Now, if you pre-order games, to be honest, you don't get to bitch and moan about it after the fact. You made your choice and you're supporting that system. You've spent your money, you've put your money on the table, and you're committed to that product. And if that product doesn't live up to it afterwards, you don't get to bitch about it. Because if you didn't have confidence in that product, then, you should have just waited for it to release. But in the past, there was a legitimate reason for pre-ordering. This was to ensure enough copies went out to consumers when, there was the majority of sales were physical. This at the same time would be minimizing unnecessary costs in terms of distribution, which is expensive. I mean, if you think about shifting an extra 100,000 copies abroad, that's going to cost you quite a lot. And then not to mention the fact that if those just end up sitting on shelves instead of being sold, you're kind of throwing away money on distribution. There was a good enough reason also to incentivize this because, you needed people to be pushed to make these things happen, to get pre-orders. Because back when you did that, people didn't really care whether they got it day one. I regularly used to not pre-order games, and I could usually be sure to find it in a store somewhere. So I just was like, I'll just go out and get it. I don't need to pre-order. But for the game company, they want people to pre-order. They want to make sure that they're, not sending too many copies, but they also want to make sure that they're getting your money down to secure that copy. Pre-ordering now is largely not necessary at all, as so much distribution is done digitally. Pre-orders aside, let's look now at the hype campaign. Now, you guys know hype is something I am very, very, against. I hate it. It really frustrates me. But why? Well, hype is that mechanic which leads early on to a lot of excitement, but ultimately can lead to your frustration, disappointment, and spending your money on something that later would not be able to meet yours or anybody else's expectations. But who is to blame for the accuracy of those expectations? You? Media? The publishers? The devs? Now, when I've spoken about hype and pre-orders and season passes, my general opinion are that pre-orders are not always exclusively a bad thing. Now, stay with me on this. If you feel certain that a game is worth your purchase and you want to either support that or you're such a huge fan, you are absolutely 100% that you need that extra shiny token, then go for it. I can think of a few games myself that I would definitely put money down on because I am absolutely certain that I would purchase those games. Battlefield is probably one of them. I would probably pre-order Battlefield because it's just a title that I know I would purchase. There's no two ways about it. Whether it's bad or good, I'm probably going to purchase it because I just, so that's one that I put money down for. Other games that I am just very passionate about that I would love. So look at something like City Skylines. I would if they made a new City Skylines, there is no question I would put money down for that. The up and coming Planet Coaster, again, I would 100% put money down on that. So there are games out there which if you have confidence enough in that product, or you just know it's something that you're definitely going to buy, there's no reason why you shouldn't pre-order that game. On the other hand, though, over-promoting pre-orders is where we now find ourselves recently. Publishers push pre-orders harder than ever. And why? Because they want to offer you some shiny in-game aesthetic item. Come on, the only reason from the publisher's point of view is to minimize financial risk. If the game tanks hard, well, at least they made some of their money back. Or to be honest, judging by the figures we looked at earlier, not just money back, but at most of the game's sales. The benefit to the player for pre-ordering is negligible and often just aesthetic, because other gamers hate the idea of someone getting a day one advantage over them, especially by paying real world cash. The hilarious irony in that is that so many people are pre-ordering, the majority of the people starting the game would all have that advantage anyway. Plus you have to consider that pressure from friends we talked about earlier. Not to mention then bundled offers, extra bits and pieces offered from stores, it goes on and on. Everything incentivizing you to buy. Now, pre-ordering culture is a problem, but is it even the biggest problem? For me, the answer to that is just quite frankly no. It's a bandwagon that everybody wants to jump on at the moment because it's the trend to do so. It's fashionable to hate pre-orders. Yet pre-orders are not where people should be directing their biggest frustration. They should direct this at season passes and also the hype in the run-up to release. And remember, some of that hype comes from gamers themselves just as well as the media. We should all be just reminding each other, come on guys, feet on the ground, calm down. Now, why do I hate season passes so much? Well, simply, as I have said before, there is literally zero reason other than saving yourself a little bit of money, usually about 10%, in buying that season pass early for a game. In the past, games would bring out an expansion for a game when the community was still strong and clearly ready for it. Now this has changed in the past years, where expansions or DLC are now seen as something to accompany and be sold alongside a main title's release. The problem with this is that developers and publishers can only estimate as to whether or not their game will still have a community at the time the DLC comes in. Now I am certain you could hazard a guess at some of the titles that this has happened with, as there have been many over the past 2 years. So what you end up with, the season pass, is just a very risky purchase. I never even see a disclaimer next to it. You know, in adverts where they put like a little asterisk next to something and then in 6-point small print it should say game experience for DLC content not guaranteed, because they have not got a clue if the community is going to exist 4 months into the game. Yes, you're going to receive that promised content, score a big check next to that. But it would make far more sense from a consumer point of view to wait until the DLC releases and then check how well the community is going. And also, if you still even enjoy the game at that point. Otherwise, you're potentially spending out the same money as the game itself on content that you have no idea if you'll even enjoy to play or if you'll have anybody to play it with. I mean, some of the most recent games that have come out, AAA titles, and at this point, maybe 1 month, 2 months down the line, you can't even get in on most of those game modes because there's literally nobody there to play it with. Now when it comes to hype, no doubt it drives some early sales, but hype for me has a far bigger problem in that it makes gamers have over-exaggerated expectations. I've seen this happen more times than I care to think about, and it frustrates the hell out of me. As I said already, hype is driven by gaming media, usually mainstream sites and YouTube. But those are just the platforms. Who are the people who feed that hype? Gamers, of course. Gamers are our own worst enemies. The more you want, the more you watch, the more you expect, the more likely you are to be disappointed. People's expectations are driven by what ifs and maybes and speculation. Now, speculation in and of itself is not a bad thing. I've done it plenty of times in videos, there's nothing wrong with it. Asking questions like, could we see this? What if we saw this? Wouldn't it be great if the game had X, Y, Z? The bad kind of speculation is when people latch onto a small snippet of information and then milk it. We caught a small glimpse of info. What does it mean? What could it mean? Now, I'm sure I've made parody videos of this kind of thing in the past because it's quite simply clickbait and nothing more. This massive overhyping of a small and probably very likely to change piece of information gets people really over expecting and imagining and wanting things that will possibly but very likely not feature in the main game. This kind of content is not only exploitative of the viewer, but it also hurts people's expectations and potentially their ultimate enjoyment of that game in question. Now gamers, as I said, will drive this somewhat themselves on YouTube, on forums, things like Reddit, where they'll scavenge for any small fragment of info and then speculate the Christ out of it. So when eventually the game releases, it feels watered down. It just doesn't excite as you wanted it to. It means that you're more likely to just tire of the game because it never had that spark you expected, that spark of discovery, of exploring, of finding things out for yourself, instead of being spoon-fed it over a 12 or 24-month period that will, push you towards that pre-order. Now, developers and producers are far from blameless when it comes to hype too. This is somewhat different from hype generated by the community because it's sometimes intentional and certainly sometimes unintentional. Again, it happens broadly, so rather than point a finger at one thing and say, you were the one, just consider it generally. So say a game showcases an early version at a trade show. Chances are anyone you would hope with some sense about them would understand this is an early build version, and you deduce that from the fact that it's being showcased far in advance of its release. If the game has a confirmed near release date, then you'll realise this is more likely to represent a final product. As a game develops, it will change. Graphics, UI, size of the map, features. It's in development, meaning it's not finished. This is why, if I visit shows, if I speak to developers, be it indie dev or AAA title, they're usually very keen to stress these are early builds and not necessarily representing the final product, because they don't want you to walk away with the impression of it and later be like, what the hell, that's not what I saw at the show. Or sometimes devs will send you an early version of the game to test. They'll always stress, this is not final, it's still in development. The community though largely seems to not really grasp this quite obvious situation. And that's a huge generalization. I'm sure that there are plenty of you guys who can see when something is showcased that it could potentially change, but by and large, it seems like most people take these things at face value, and therefore, if it later changes, they end up disappointed. That's why we hear so much outrage when a game later along doesn't quite fit with people's estimations the first time they laid eyes on it. It's like I've said though for the longest time, if you go into something with your feet on the ground and a realistic through process of what you might expect, then you're far less likely to be disappointed than if you go in expecting the world. Now, is it wrong to expect a game to blow you away in what it delivers? Of course not. We always hope a game goes above and beyond our expectations, but it's far better to expect less and not be disappointed than to build your expectations far above what is likely possible. You're just setting yourself up for an inevitable fall. Another example would be when a developer or producer throws out a snippet of information to drive pre-sales hype. Let's be clear though, this is standard marketing practice. That's their job after all, is to sell the product. And this happens in all products, all over the world, everywhere. The problem is, most normal products have specific set features to highlight and promote before it goes on sale. Games are in the unusual situation of having details about them that can change much more drastically, even very late in development, or just may not fully work as intended once they're released. As a producer or a journalist, you also walk into muddy areas where you might get information about a feature that then turns out to be not accurate or sometimes just flat out wrong. The responsibility with how to, have that game information and then use it lies with the producer or the journalist, and how accurately they convey that this information is subject to change. Then again, if a dev has conveyed this as something that will exist but then later it's not, well, that's on them. I don't think the developers or publishers would regularly provide misinformation though. There's no reason, there's nothing positive in doing that. It's more likely that things, snippets of information that get released about the game to generate discussion or ask social media, like, okay, which thing would you prefer, vote A or B? These kind of questions naturally lead to discussion and speculation, and the devs and publishers know it. That's the reason why they do it. My point though is that this does little for the game itself other than to generate intentional hype, which again leads to people then wildly speculating over expectations about the product. So the creators are generating intentional hype, which causes unintentional over expectation. Now you compare that to a game like Fallout, where they really released no snippets or no trailers. There was little tiny pieces here and there, but nothing really, and then they just drop the game. Now that is completely different. It means that everybody goes in with that really driven, exploring expectation, and nothing is really leaked out. It's completely different. Other games did it as well. Alien Isolation really had no true kind of like hype campaign, yet that game sold very well and was very, very well received. So again, it's a real difference between that and companies which really drive and push this hype machine. And it's interesting that games like Fallout and Alien Isolation were generally very, very well received and had, not a lot of negativity directed from the community towards them, but games which are overhyped seem to have a lot more negativity associated with them. Again, it's only, there's no quantitative way of really figuring that out, but I think if you just look around at a general trend, and, I think you guys would do that, I would do that, people that are interested in games, if you look at games which don't have such crazy hype campaigns, they tend to sort of fare better in community opinion than games which really go overboard with it. I think there's a fairly reasonable correlation to make there. Now, another great example of this will recently be, no surprise, The Division. Now, I'll talk about that more on an upcoming podcast, but the long and short of it is that I'd seen very little about the game prior to the closed beta. I'd been aware of it, I'd seen it kind of first showcased at E3. I was like, okay, it looks like a Tom Clancy kind of Ghost Recon game, etc, etc. My regular squad as well had similarly seen very little about it. I was kind of keeping half an eye on it, but I'd not really sort of investigated it fully. I just let the game come, right? I found myself to truly enjoy the experience with The Division. I certainly couldn't describe it as disappointing or a letdown or not what was promised. Yet a large section of the community seemed greatly unhappy with the game. I attribute this directly to community hype and a misreading of early development, not misleading content by the publishers or the developers. So, in conclusion, what can we learn about the current state of game releases and how pre-purchase hype are fueling people's disappointment post-release? The most obvious conclusion is that publishers and developers clearly have a sales model which suits their product very well. Even when games fail, they aren't really a failure because pre-purchases fueled by hype are so strong. This means that even if a game crashes after launch, there is no real incentive for the publisher or developer to look too deeply into why it went wrong, because they're making anything like 80% of their sales before the game is even out there. Despite the gaming community being louder than ever about its contempt for pre-ordering games, the numbers just don't seem to back this up, suggesting it's a very vocal minority who propagate this opinion. Publishers want to minimize risk for sales. They want to sell as much as possible, including DLC, as early as possible. In order to sell a game pre-release, they need to hype that game as much as possible. That is done through standard marketing, media, and community-driven speculation. For the consumer, this hype serves to benefit those producing the games and the people creating that media. It negatively impacts many consumers by raising their expectations and setting them up for a game which then can't possibly deliver what they want at release. There are several ways you can test this theory out. If a game which you felt disappointed you at release and you quickly shelved, go back, give it a second look. Ask yourself, was it truly that bad? Chances are, more often than not, you'll find that on reflection, if you are objective, it actually wasn't as terrible as you thought. I've had this with games recently, and it's surprising how that breakaway changes your feelings. Also, if you're able to, and it's hard, but if you're able to pay little or no attention to a game before it's close to release, you should find that your experience is quite different to other people. I found this myself, as well as with friends, agree that the hype train only damages your experience at release by having either revealed too much and thereby robbing you of the excitement, or just overinflating your expectations. Now, another good example, remember how when the new Star Wars film came out recently, people were literally freaking out if anyone revealed the tiniest fragment of information? I remember seeing people saying that they were imposing a self-imposed media blackout on themselves so as to not spoil it and maximize their enjoyment. Well, when it comes to games, we do the opposite of this. We search and search like an unhinged detective, seizing on the smallest hints of information and then speculating like crazy. Well, instead, we should object to this kind of leaking so as to preserve the experience and then enjoy it at release in the same way people did with the new Star Wars movie. If people were not so hyped prior to release, maybe they wouldn't pre-order, and maybe developers and producers would work to ensure the experience from day one was as perfect as possible to ensure strong sales in that first month, instead of selling a product based on marketing which no one can truly know what will happen despite all the goodwill in the world. Ask yourself this: do you gamble often? If the answer is no, then why do you pre-order games and season passes? The game will still be there at release, but you'll spend your money safely. And you'll send a message to producers and developers that they need to ensure that product is quality and that they cannot afford to fail these games at release and just allow them to crash and burn. This has been Luton talking about hype and pre-orders. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like and your thoughts down in the comments.